Hey guys, tonight we take a deep dive into a time when the world was still so much larger than most could imagine. Picture yourself standing on the shore, gazing at the vast ocean stretching into an unknown horizon. Ships, full of mystery and promise, are about to change everything. But before the transatlantic slave trade would tear apart the very fabric of societies, this was a time when the world was small. No, not just small, utterly isolated. It was a time of myths, missed opportunities, and mysterious lands no European had yet set foot on. You feel the wind tug at your clothes, a mixture of salt and dust, as you try to imagine what it was like for those living in a world unaware of the transatlantic empire building that was about to begin. Before the first slave ships crossed the ocean, before slavery was an official institution, the world looked like something different entirely. It was a world where people were living in close-knit, rural societies, surviving on what they could farm, fish, or trade. No one could yet imagine how that world would soon be shattered by greed, violence, and the lust for power. So, what was it really like before the Europeans made their deadly mark? Historians still argue whether the indigenous peoples of Africa and the Americas were simply living out their days in peaceful bliss or whether their societies were already caught in their own power struggles. Either way, they weren't thinking about mass exploitation, until, of course, the ships arrived. Let's talk about geography for a second. The world wasn't divided in the neat, tidy way we think of today. It was, in fact, a gigantic maze of cultures, empires, and kingdoms, often clashing or living in harmonious isolation, unaware of the forces already preparing to rewrite their destinies. In the Americas, vast civilizations like the Aztecs and Incas were thriving, oblivious to the growing demands of European greed. Meanwhile, across the ocean in Africa, kingdoms rose and fell like the tides themselves, controlling resources that would soon be coveted by the rest of the world. And then, of course, there were the European explorers, who saw these lands through a lens of one thing: profit. The Portuguese were the first to really get the whole exploration thing going, with their savvy knowledge of navigation and winds. But they weren't the only ones. Spain was hot on their heels, eager to claim whatever they could. The wind didn't just carry their ships. It carried opportunity, a chance to corner a market that was ripe for exploitation. But here's where it all begins. These ships were sailing toward lands that no one really understood. They had rumors, half-baked maps, and the fervent desire to turn unseen riches into gold. In fact, the first trade wasn't even about slaves. It was about gold, sugar, spices, anything and everything that could make them rich. Historians still argue whether the early voyages were driven by a pure desire for wealth, or a mix of empire building and religious zeal. The famous myth of Columbus, thinking he could find a faster route to India, wasn't just about wanting to become wealthy. It was also about spreading Christianity. Still, the winds of change were blowing, and they didn't stop for anyone. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas marked the beginning of a massive shift in global power, and the ripple effects would eventually lead to an institution that changed the world forever. But before any of that, it was just a matter of getting there, sailing into the unknown, guided by the simple, overpowering belief that wealth and dominance were just over the horizon. But there's a twist here. The winds weren't just blowing toward the Americas. They were pushing toward Africa too. By the time European explorers began to notice what was going on in Africa, they were itching to find ways to harness its resources. But there was a problem. They didn't quite know what they were getting into. Africa's kingdoms were complex, sophisticated, and powerful in ways that Europeans hadn't anticipated. But in their blind search for wealth, they underestimated what they would soon encounter. The Europeans didn't just stumble upon Africa. They stumbled into the intricacies of a continent whose cultures and societies were far more advanced than they realized. So, as you stand there watching the ships sail on the horizon, the world's about to become much smaller. The waves of change are on the move, but they're only the beginning. The great winds of change are coming, and what's about to unfold will rewrite history in ways nobody could have predicted. Alright, let's rewind for a second. You're standing there on the deck of a ship, your eyes fixed on the horizon. There's gold in them there hills, or so the stories go. Those old maps you've heard about. They're promising wealth and riches beyond belief. But here's the thing, what they don't tell you is that it's not just about gold. It's about something far more elusive and dangerous. You see, this hunger for gold? It didn't just come out of nowhere. It came from centuries of European kings and queens who were desperate to expand their influence and wealth. To do that, they needed the goods that could keep their nations afloat. And what better way to secure that than through trade? But let's take a closer look. Gold was just the beginning. What the Europeans really wanted was a monopoly over trade. They weren't going to settle for just a piece of the pie. They were after the whole bakery. To do that, they needed labor, lots of it. And labor, my friend, was something they didn't exactly have in abundance back home. In the race for riches, this quickly evolved into a devastating need, people to do the work. And not just any people, enslaved people. Historians still argue about what truly motivated the early explorers. Was it the thirst for gold that led them to Africa, or was it the prospect of sugar, spices, and other luxuries? The answer is probably a bit of both. As Portugal and Spain carved out their first footholds in Africa, they found themselves not just searching for gold but also for the perfect labor force to work the land in the New World. And guess what? They found it, eventually. But the path they took wasn't just lined with opportunities. It was lined with greed that would tear apart lives and cultures. It's easy to imagine those early explorers dreaming of untold riches, imagining how gold would pour into their coffers and transform their lives. But there's a darker side to that dream. Gold wasn't just about money, it was about power. And the one thing that those early explorers understood well was that the more power you had, the more you could control. And what better way to control your empire than through the labor of others? But here's the kicker, the explorers weren't just in it for their own personal gain. No, they were backed by the powerful institutions of the day, European monarchies that saw colonial expansion as a way to increase their wealth and influence. The Portuguese, followed by the Spanish, were among the first to set up trading posts on the west coast of Africa. What started as a search for gold quickly turned into a search for something far more lucrative, human labor. And this wasn't some small-time operation. This was big business. European powers began negotiating with local African rulers for slaves, using everything from beads and firearms to rum and cloth as currency. You can almost see them rubbing their hands together, envisioning the profits that would come from exploiting the very people they barely understood. The thing is, this wasn't a simple case of buying and selling, as we might think today. It was a systematic, brutal process that would reshape the world. It was slavery, but it was also economics. And once this machine started churning, it didn't stop. It just kept getting bigger. Now let's pause here. You probably thought this whole slave trade thing started with people just carting slaves around willy-nilly. It wasn't like that. The real start of the trade was much more calculated. These were very real negotiations between African kingdoms and European traders, often involving complex political and social dynamics. It's important to remember that not all African leaders were passive players in this. Some were active participants, offering up prisoners of war or captives in exchange for goods. This wasn't a simple case of good guys versus bad guys. As with any historical conflict, the reality was much murkier. Historians still debate whether African rulers knew the full extent of the horrors that the transatlantic slave trade would eventually bring, or if they were just trying to survive within a global system that was rapidly expanding and changing. But one thing is for sure, once the Europeans realized that they could make huge profits from this system, they weren't about to let go. The wheels of the transatlantic slave trade were set in motion, and they were powered by a very simple force, an insatiable hunger for gold, and, as it turned out, human lives. This is where it starts getting tricky. The moment gold and human labor were tied together, there was no turning back. The shift from exploration to exploitation was quick and brutal. With each new map, each new discovery, the trade grew stronger. What began as a quest for gold morphed into an empire of profit built on the backs of the enslaved. And remember those maps? They weren't just poorly drawn, they were fueling the fire, guiding European ships to lands where resources and people were waiting to be harvested. But it wasn't just the Portuguese or the Spanish who were involved in this game. As the centuries rolled on, more and more nations jumped on the bandwagon, all eager to carve out their piece of the riches. And along with them came the real villains of this story, the merchants, traders, and profiteers, each one more willing than the last to exploit whatever they could. But at the heart of it all was greed that would ultimately lead to a system that stretched across oceans, continents, and centuries, leaving behind scars that would last for generations. Alright, picture this. You've just come across a map, one of those big, hand-drawn, mysterious maps that looks more like a piece of abstract art than a true guide to the world. These maps are the product of explorers who, while remarkably brave, were not exactly top-tier cartographers. Their understanding of the world was filled with gaps, wild guesses, and occasional bouts of wishful thinking. But let's be real, these bad boys were all the rage back then. They weren't just navigation tools, they were prophecies shaping the future of entire continents. Yet, in hindsight, these maps look like something a child might doodle during a long, boring afternoon. Now, this is where things get interesting. As you glance at these maps, you notice something odd. There are places marked that don't quite match the reality of the land. Parts of Africa, for example, are shown as either much smaller or more simplistic than they actually are. They were guessing where the gold mines were, sketching out vague, oversized coastlines, and marking territories with no real understanding of what lay within. But here's the thing. Despite their inaccuracies, these maps were seen as gospel truth at the time. They were the foundation for everything: the navigation systems, the trade routes, and ultimately, the slave trade itself. Historians still argue whether these early maps were a result of lazy exploration or deliberate misrepresentation. Was it simply the case that explorers didn't know enough about the lands they were encountering, or were these maps designed to flatter European superiority, showing the world as a mysterious but conquerable land? Either way, these maps played a huge role in shaping how the Europeans perceived Africa and the Americas. And that perception? Well, it was woefully misguided. Imagine for a second that you're an explorer on one of these early voyages. You've set sail from Portugal or Spain, heading toward the New World. On your map, there's a rough sketch of what might be the west coast of Africa, dotted with symbols for potential riches, though none of it is quite clear. The coastlines are inaccurately drawn, and the inland regions are mostly blank spaces, marked with "Here be dragons" types of warnings. You have no idea that Africa is full of kingdoms, each with its own complex social, political, and economic structures. No, in your mind, it's just a place to stop and grab whatever resources you can, before heading back to Europe with your prize. But here's the real kicker. These bad maps not only led Europeans to underestimate Africa's complexity, they also set the stage for a false sense of superiority. These explorers, armed with their bad maps, took it as a given that Africa was a land of untapped potential, waiting to be discovered and exploited. They saw the continent as a treasure chest just waiting to be unlocked. The reality, of course, was far from that. They were sailing into a rich, diverse world that was already occupied by sophisticated societies and advanced cultures. But the bad maps couldn't, and didn't, show that. They simply left vast swaths of land uncharted, as if to suggest that the continent itself was some kind of blank slate, ready to be written upon by the hands of European explorers. Historians still debate whether these bad maps were a result of the limitations of the time or whether they were deliberate oversimplifications to justify exploitation. After all, if you want to conquer, you need to believe the land you're conquering isn't already occupied by complex systems and civilizations. But that's the beauty of a map, right? It doesn't just show you where to go, it shapes how you think about the world around you. If you see Africa as a vast, mysterious land of unknowns, you're more likely to view it as something to be conquered. It was easier to imagine it as a land waiting to be colonized, rather than a place full of people, cultures, and histories. These maps also played a huge role in navigating what we now call the Middle Passage, the horrific journey that enslaved Africans were forced to endure across the Atlantic. If these maps had shown more than vague outlines and guesses, maybe, just maybe, things could have been different. But the way they were drawn, and the way they depicted the world helped to cement the belief that what lay beyond was for the taking. No need for context, no need for understanding, just the promise of riches. As these maps were reproduced and passed around, they became tools of imperialism. They weren't just there to help explorers avoid rocks and dangerous currents. No, these maps were about control. They helped establish trade routes, and later, they helped guide the ships involved in the transatlantic slave trade, cementing Africa's role in a system of exploitation and extraction. In a way, they were as much a part of the machine of empire as the guns, ships, and money that followed in their wake. So, next time you pull up a map to navigate a trip, remember, some maps don't just tell you where to go, they also tell you how to think about the places you're headed. Now that we've set the stage with bad maps and the insatiable hunger for wealth, let's talk about how this all started taking shape into something far darker. Something that would change the world forever. You're standing on a dock somewhere in Africa, or perhaps the Caribbean, or even the southern tip of the Americas. The air is thick with tension. Ships are pulling into port, cargo holds packed with goods from all corners of the world. But it's not the cargo that you should be focusing on. It's the people. The men and women, their lives about to be traded in exchange for some beads, some guns, or perhaps, in some cases, a couple of barrels of rum. This is where the transatlantic slave trade first started to gain momentum, and it wasn't pretty. The early days weren't about massive slave ships packed to the brim with human lives. No, it began with much smaller operations. As the Portuguese and Spanish began establishing trade routes along Africa's west coast, they discovered that the ideal resource wasn't gold or spices. It was human labor. Africa, with its complex societies and rich resources, wasn't just a place to plunder. No, it had something else that the Europeans needed: people who could work the land, cultivate crops, and mine minerals. It didn't take long for this to become the focal point of European trading efforts. Historians still debate whether slavery on the continent was already a practice before Europeans arrived. Was it a common institution in African kingdoms, or was it something that Europeans created by forcing African leaders into a system they couldn't control? Regardless of the answer, what is clear is that the European demand for human labor changed the course of history. The Europeans didn't just want slaves, they wanted an endless supply of them. The trade was supposed to be a mutually beneficial arrangement between European traders and African rulers. Or at least, that's what the traders told themselves to justify it. This shift was subtle at first. African kingdoms, many of which had been trading slaves within the continent for centuries, now found themselves entangled in a much larger, more dangerous system. European traders showed up with their shiny trinkets, firearms, and rum, offering them in exchange for people. Some African rulers seized the opportunity to sell prisoners of war or those who had fallen on hard times, viewing it as just another form of commerce. After all, the Europeans were offering valuable goods in return, and they couldn't have known that the trade would escalate into an operation of such scale and cruelty. But let's not sugarcoat it. Even though there was a certain business as usual aspect for some African kingdoms, this was no ordinary trade. The process was brutal, with lives being sold off like cattle. And it wasn't just about providing workers for the Americas, it was also about shifting the balance of power on the continent. The demand for slaves increased exponentially as the European powers, namely Portugal, Spain, and later Britain, France, and the Netherlands, began establishing lucrative plantations in the New World. The demand grew so large that the political and social structures of Africa began to feel the strain. Power shifted from kingdoms that refused to participate to those that were more willing to engage in the slave trade. Here's where things start to get tricky. Historians still argue over whether African rulers fully understood the long-term consequences of the trade. Did they think the trade would be a brief exchange, or did they realize they were helping to create something monstrous? Some argue that they knew, at least on some level, what was happening. Others suggest that it was a complex political game, one in which the stakes were so high that survival meant going along with the Europeans' demands. The Europeans, after all, weren't only offering shiny beads and guns, they were offering access to a new world of power and wealth. The trade had its undeniable allure. The Portuguese were the pioneers in all of this, and their involvement helped create a blueprint for others. They started establishing what we now know as slave forts along the west coast of Africa. These were fortified outposts, usually built on top of existing trading settlements, where slaves were stored until they could be shipped across the ocean. These forts became the base of operations for the European slave traders who were looking to make their fortune in the Americas. It wasn't long before the British, French, Dutch, and others jumped into the fray, and by the mid-1600s, the transatlantic slave trade was in full swing. And let's talk numbers for a second. Historians have estimated that somewhere between 12 and 12.8 million Africans were forcibly shipped to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries. That's not a small number. But what's even more staggering is how those numbers were achieved. It wasn't just a matter of capturing a few individuals here and there. No, the trade became industrialized. Whole villages were wiped out as European traders made deals with African kingdoms. The transportation of human lives became a business, and with that came the efficiency of mass production. By the time the trade peaked, it had morphed into a deadly machine, with ships making regular voyages from Africa to the Americas. It was no longer just a handful of enslaved individuals, it was an entire system built on their backs. But here's the thing that still stirs debate. Did the enslaved Africans know the scale of what was coming? Did they know that their lives would be shipped across the ocean, bound for a land they had never seen? The earliest captives were often taken as prisoners of war, so many did not even know they were being sold into slavery. And once they were shackled and forced into the cramped holds of ships, it was too late. The reality of the trade hadn't fully settled in yet. The first steps toward this cruel trade were small, almost imperceptible. But by the time the Europeans started seeing the full extent of their gains, it was too late to turn back. The transatlantic slave trade was no longer just a collection of isolated deals. It was a full-fledged system, one built on a foundation of suffering, greed, and exploitation. And it was only just beginning. Ah, rum. You probably didn't expect to hear that word associated with the transatlantic slave trade, right? But if you think about it, rum played a surprisingly crucial role in keeping the whole horrific system running. You're standing on the deck of a ship again, and instead of the usual wares, gold, sugar, cotton, spices, let's talk about something else, alcohol. Specifically rum? Yeah, that's right. The very same drink that people sip around campfires or on tropical beaches was also a central piece of the machinery that fueled one of the darkest chapters in history. So, how did rum find its way into this grim story? It's not just that people wanted to have a drink after a hard day of work. No, rum became one of the most valuable commodities in the slave trade. And it wasn't just for the traders to relax after a tough day of negotiations. No, it was used as currency. Yes, you heard that right, currency to buy human lives. This wasn't just about bartering trinkets or guns anymore. Rum, along with things like beads and cloth, became part of the brutal bargain. Historians still argue about how exactly rum came to be so deeply woven into the fabric of the trade. Some say that the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, which relied on enslaved labor, created a massive surplus of molasses, a byproduct of sugar production. This molasses was then turned into rum, which was shipped back to Africa in exchange for slaves. But the larger truth here is that rum wasn't just a side product of the sugar trade, it became an essential part of the economics of the entire system. It's almost as if the rum itself had a role to play in maintaining the balance of cruelty. But why rum? Why not something else? Well, it turns out that alcohol, specifically rum, was easy to produce and relatively cheap to make. So, as demand for slaves increased, European traders and plantation owners in the Caribbean found it highly efficient to use rum as a trade good. It was, in a twisted sense, the perfect exchange. Rum was relatively inexpensive, so it didn't take much to acquire large quantities. It was also a product that people valued in the West African markets, so it served as an ideal medium of exchange for enslaved people. So picture this, you're standing in one of the bustling ports along the African coast. It's hot, and you can hear the chatter of merchants and the clinking of goods being exchanged. The rum barrels are stacked high, ready to be loaded onto ships destined for the Americas. But they're not just for drinking on a lazy Sunday afternoon. These barrels are being traded for human lives. Lives that will soon be shackled and crammed into the holds of ships, bound for a completely different world. The rum, combined with other goods, becomes a bargaining chip for the traders. For each barrel of rum, an African kingdom might receive a handful of enslaved individuals, who will then be transported across the ocean to work on sugar and cotton plantations. It wasn't just that rum was an easy exchange. Rum also had a psychological power. Alcohol had the ability to disarm, to lower resistance, and to make the brutality of the transaction feel more palatable. Think about it. The trader offers a drink to seal the deal, and suddenly, everything feels more civilized, less brutal. It's like the alcohol acts as a kind of social lubricant, helping to smooth over the monstrous reality of what's happening. Of course, the enslaved Africans weren't the ones getting any of the rum. No, they were the ones being traded for it. And while it might have been consumed by the traders and their African counterparts, it was a silent witness to the horrors that would follow. Historians still debate whether rum and other alcoholic beverages were used to directly manipulate the African sellers or whether it was simply a reflection of the larger colonial system, one that relied on the economic efficiency of exploitation. Either way, it's hard to ignore the role that alcohol, rum in particular, played in helping grease the wheels of the entire operation. It's the kind of fact that feels surreal, almost like a bizarre subplot in an otherwise tragic tale, but it's real. The drink that might bring cheer to some was, in this case, another tool in the arsenal of colonialism. Rum didn't just stay in the trade itself, it became a symbol of the economic systems that fueled the slave trade. Sugar and rum were entwined in the economies of the Caribbean and the Americas, forming a triangle of trade. As sugar plantations grew, so did the demand for enslaved people to work them. And as that demand grew, so did the need for more rum to keep the system running. It was a perverse loop, one that made the economies of the Caribbean, and by extension, Europe, wealthy beyond measure, at the expense of millions of lives. So next time you think about the history of rum, maybe take a moment to remember that it wasn't always just about sipping on something sweet. It was a cornerstone in the brutal system that defined the transatlantic slave trade, and in its own way, rum helped sustain a machine of exploitation and suffering. The next time someone mentions rum in a historical context, don't just think of happy beach vacations. Think of those ships, those cargo holds packed with human lives, and the barrels of rum that helped make it all possible. Alright, let's take a step back from the nightmare of the Middle Passage, but not for long. Picture yourself now in the Caribbean, or maybe the Southern American colonies. What's happening here? Well, this is where the real money is being made. The transatlantic slave trade didn't just exist for the sake of moving people across the ocean. It was all part of a much larger system of exploitation, one designed to feed the voracious demand for sugar, cotton, and other lucrative crops. And the lifeblood of that system? It was forced labor, plain and simple. The sugar plantations in the Caribbean were the heart of this operation. These vast estates required a constant, steady supply of workers, millions of workers, if they were to continue producing the sugar that Europeans were gobbling up by the ton. It wasn't just about satisfying a craving for sweets. No, sugar was a cash crop, a commodity that was in high demand across Europe and the Americas. It was used to sweeten coffee, tea, and even the ever-popular rum. Remember that lovely drink from earlier? That fueled much of the trade. But here's where the trade gets even darker. Sugar wasn't the only crop being harvested by enslaved labor. Cotton, tobacco, and rice were all part of the deal, and they, too, would go on to fuel the economies of the Americas and Europe. But it's sugar we need to focus on right now because it was the real driver of the transatlantic slave economy. Without sugar, the demand for enslaved labor would have looked very different. The sugar plantations were not just places of work, they were places of absolute brutality. The enslaved Africans on these plantations were forced to work long hours in grueling conditions. The sugar cane had to be harvested by hand, with sharp machetes, and the crushing mills to process the sugar were dangerous and often deadly. Disease ran rampant, especially malaria and yellow fever, which were spread in the swamps and humid conditions of the Caribbean. It wasn't uncommon for enslaved people to die from exhaustion or disease within a few years of arrival, if they even lasted that long. But the Europeans, of course, were more concerned with their profits than with the lives of the people providing their wealth. Historians still debate how much European consumers really knew about the brutality behind their sugar, cotton, and tobacco. Did they care? Was there any guilt associated with enjoying products built on the backs of the enslaved? Many argue that the answer is a resounding no. The demand for these goods was so high that the human cost was minimized in the minds of European consumers. Sugar, after all, was a luxury, a sign of wealth and status. And no one questioned how it was being produced, as long as the sweet product made its way to their tables and into their teacups. It was a classic case of economic growth at the expense of human dignity. And those profits were staggering. Sugar was one of the most profitable crops in the world, and it was sold at incredible prices. The slave owners raked in unimaginable wealth as the enslaved people toiled under the brutal sun, cutting and processing sugar cane, while the merchants who transported the sugar pocketed their share of the profits. The laborers who cultivated the very crop were often worked to death or broken by the horrors of the process. But it didn't stop there. As the demand for sugar increased, so did the need for more enslaved people to work the fields. And when the sugar plantations weren't enough, other crops like cotton and tobacco were grown in the southern colonies of what would later become the United States. The southern economy became dependent on slavery in a way that few could ever have predicted. The transatlantic slave trade and the agricultural labor it supported were two sides of the same coin. Historians still argue about the long-term impact of these industries on the economic and social structures of both the Americas and Europe. Was the global economy built on the backs of the enslaved, or were there other, more sustainable economic systems in place? Either way, the evidence is clear. The profits from these crops, particularly sugar, helped fuel the further expansion of slavery. More plantations, more ships, more enslaved people. Each new addition was like a gear in a larger machine that was impossible to stop. As you stand there in the sun, looking out over the fields of sugar cane, it's impossible not to see the human cost of it all. The land may seem lush and fertile, but beneath the green crops lies the dark history of exploitation. The men and women who worked these fields were treated like nothing more than tools, their lives worth less than the profits made from the sugar they produced. And as the sugar flowed, so did the wealth of the European powers, driving the global economy to new heights while reinforcing systems of racial inequality and oppression. So, next time you take a bite of something sweet, think about how that sugar got to your table. Think about the labor, the bloodshed, and the injustice that went into making it. Because, in the end, that sweet taste was built on a foundation of suffering, a foundation that would take centuries to dismantle. Alright, let's zoom out for a moment and picture the world of the plantation. You're standing on one of the sprawling estates in the Americas. The land stretches far beyond what the eye can see, lush and green with fields of sugar, cotton, and tobacco. It looks almost idyllic at first glance, doesn't it? The bright sun, the rolling hills, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But that tranquility masks a much darker reality. This land, this wealth, was built on the backs of enslaved people, men, women, and children who were forced to work under grueling conditions, day after day, with no hope of ever seeing freedom. The plantation economy wasn't just about producing crops. It was an entire system built to extract as much labor as possible from the enslaved people working it. It wasn't just about getting crops to market. It was about creating a self-sustaining system of profit where every part was interconnected. The plantations had everything they needed: labor, land, and the capital to keep the wheels turning. But here's the kicker: the enslaved people were the ones who made it all possible. When you think of a plantation, you probably imagine a grand house, maybe some manicured gardens, a few servants in the background. But that's only half the story. The real work, the labor that kept the plantation running, was happening out of sight, in the fields, in the sweat-drenched heat. The enslaved were given the brutal task of planting, harvesting, and processing the crops, with no regard for their well-being. Workdays could last from sunup to sundown, and often beyond. Any sign of weakness, any protest, was met with brutal punishment. But this wasn't just about cruelty, it was about control. The plantation owners knew that the only way to maintain their wealth was to keep the enslaved population under their thumb, to ensure they couldn't revolt, couldn't escape, couldn't even dream of freedom. But here's where things get complex. While the enslaved were forced to work in unimaginable conditions, the plantation owners couldn't afford to lose a single person. The system was so dependent on the labor force that if one of the enslaved workers died or became too ill to work, it wasn't just a personal loss, it was an economic blow. That's why, as brutal as the system was, the plantation owners had a vested interest in maintaining the health and survival of their human property, even if it meant working them to exhaustion. Historians still argue about the nature of this system. Was it purely about profit, or did the plantation economy become a way of life, ingrained into the fabric of society? Was it driven by greed alone, or did the social structures that emerged around slavery serve to reinforce the economic system? The answer is probably somewhere in the middle. The plantation economy didn't just feed on the labor of the enslaved, it became the society's backbone. It was so deeply ingrained in the economic, social, and political structures that it became almost impossible to imagine any other way of life. As you stand there, watching the work unfold, you realize that this system didn't just affect the enslaved. It affected everyone, especially the people who lived in the grand houses, sipping their coffee and looking out over the fields. The plantation economy was built on the idea that there would always be cheap, disposable labor. But the people working the land? They weren't disposable. They were human beings who had been stripped of their dignity and their rights. Every crop harvested, every shipment sent to Europe, every barrel of rum traded for human lives was part of a machine that turned people into property, into profit. And it wasn't just about the money either. It was about a way of life, a way of justifying the system of slavery. The plantation owners viewed their estates not just as economic engines, but as symbols of power and status. To own a plantation was to own not just land and crops, but people. The enslaved workers were an essential part of that identity. They were the ones who made the plantation system work. Without them, the entire structure would collapse. This created a terrifying paradox. The more wealth and power the plantation owners gained, the more dependent they became on the system that was built on exploitation. But here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. While the plantation owners were reaping the benefits, they were also living in fear. You see, slavery isn't just a one-way street. The enslaved people, though bound by chains, were far from powerless. In fact, every single day they resisted, whether through small acts of defiance, like slowing down their work, or more dramatic forms of rebellion. Historians still argue whether these rebellions were widespread or if they were limited to certain regions, but one thing is certain: there was always resistance. And the more brutal the system became, the more the enslaved found ways to push back. Sometimes that resistance was quiet, hidden in the shadows, in the form of everyday defiance. But other times, it was loud and violent, as the enslaved fought back against the system that sought to destroy them. The fear of rebellion was a constant for plantation owners. They knew that any hint of resistance could lead to uprisings that would put their wealth, and their lives, at risk. That's why, even as they accumulated vast amounts of wealth, they lived in constant anxiety. The plantation economy, with all its wealth and power, was built on a fragile foundation. It was a system that relied on the constant subjugation of the enslaved, a system that could be brought down with a single spark of rebellion. So, as you stand there, looking at the vast plantation stretching out before you, you realize that the plantation economy wasn't just about crops and profits. It was about control, fear, and a brutal system that kept everyone involved locked in a cycle of exploitation. And while the plantation owners reaped the rewards, it was the enslaved who paid the ultimate price. Let's shift focus a bit and explore a question that's often glossed over when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade. We tend to think of it as a one-sided system, with European traders coming in to exploit the resources of Africa and the Americas. But here's the uncomfortable truth: African kingdoms were involved too. But were they willing participants in this horrific trade, or were they simply victims of a much larger, unstoppable force? That's a question historians still argue over today. Picture this: you're standing in one of the bustling marketplaces in West Africa, surrounded by the sounds of merchants bartering, the vibrant colors of textiles, and the scent of spices in the air. But instead of buying goods, you notice something else, something unsettling. Africans, men and women, are being lined up for sale. They're not just slaves. They're human cargo, their fates sealed in exchange for weapons, rum, or cloth. You see, in the early days of the transatlantic trade, many African kingdoms weren't passive victims of European exploitation. In fact, some were deeply involved, trading enslaved individuals for goods they couldn't produce themselves. Now, before you get too upset, remember that not all African kingdoms participated in the trade willingly. There were countless African leaders who fought back against the Europeans, who saw the brutality of the system and wanted no part in it. However, others saw the trade as a necessary evil, or worse, as an opportunity to gain power and wealth. You see, African societies had their own systems of slavery long before Europeans arrived, but they were vastly different from the kind of industrialized, race-based slavery that would develop in the Americas. Slaves in Africa were often prisoners of war or individuals who had fallen into debt. They could sometimes rise in status, marry, or even own property. The idea of someone being born into slavery and condemned to a lifetime of brutal labor was foreign to many African societies. So when European traders showed up, offering firearms, gold, and textiles in exchange for people, it wasn't immediately clear that this would lead to the devastation we now associate with the slave trade. For some African rulers, the decision to engage in the trade seemed like a practical one. The Europeans weren't just offering luxuries, they were offering power. Firearms were especially attractive to African kingdoms, as they gave rulers the ability to defend their territories against rivals or enemies. In this context, it wasn't just about selling people for profit, it was about strengthening one's political and military position. Historians still debate whether African kingdoms truly understood the long-term consequences of their involvement in the slave trade. Some argue that these leaders were simply acting within the context of their own political systems, unaware, or unwilling to acknowledge, the horrors they were facilitating. Others argue that African rulers were fully aware of the consequences and chose to profit from the trade regardless of the human cost. The fact is, African involvement in the transatlantic slave trade was complex and multifaceted, and to paint it as purely a story of victimhood or villainy doesn't do justice to the nuances of the historical reality. But there's another side to this story. Not all African kingdoms participated in the trade. In fact, many resisted it outright. Some rulers took a firm stand against the Europeans, refusing to allow the capture and sale of their people. These leaders saw what the transatlantic trade was doing to their neighbors, and they knew the destructive power it had. They understood that selling people into slavery was not just an economic transaction, it was a betrayal of humanity. Some African kingdoms even went so far as to wage wars against the European traders or rival kingdoms that were involved in the trade, attempting to stop the flow of human lives. Despite this resistance, the sheer demand for enslaved people was so great that it became nearly impossible for many African kingdoms to resist. The trade created a vicious cycle of violence and instability across the continent. Kingdoms that once existed in relative peace were torn apart by internal conflict, as leaders turned against each other in a desperate scramble for European goods and military power. Neighboring kingdoms would wage wars, capturing prisoners to sell to the Europeans. The Europeans, in turn, would provide more weapons, further fueling the violence. What's particularly disturbing is how the system of slavery created a moral fog. Leaders who might have once viewed the sale of human beings as an abomination were now convinced that it was a necessary part of the global economy. They became complicit in the trade, either out of desperation or greed. The question is, how could they have known what was coming? The full horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, the scale of it, the brutality, and the lasting impact it would have on Africa, weren't clear at first. But once the system took hold, it was impossible to escape. But let's not forget that the African kingdoms were not the only ones impacted by the trade. The ripple effects of slavery were felt across the entire continent. The trade did more than just supply slaves for the Americas. It destabilized entire regions, broke up families, and turned brother against brother. And for those who were sold into slavery, the consequences were catastrophic. Many were forced to endure brutal, life-shattering journeys across the Atlantic, never to see their homeland or families again. As you stand there, reflecting on this tangled history, you realize just how complex the story of the transatlantic slave trade really is. It wasn't just about Europeans coming in and stealing people from Africa. It was about a system that lured in all kinds of participants, African rulers, European traders, and even everyday people, into an insidious network of exploitation that spanned continents and centuries. The question remains, were African kingdoms allies in this trade, or were they victims caught in the same trap of greed and violence that the Europeans had set? The answer, it turns out, isn't as simple as we'd like to think. Alright, by now, we've talked a lot about the people, the places, and the systems that enabled the transatlantic slave trade to flourish. But let's zoom out for a moment and look at the bigger picture. What was driving this whole machine? You guessed it, greed. The unchecked greed of European nations, the desire to grow their empires, expand their wealth, and, above all, to dominate the global economy. The pursuit of riches became so all-consuming that it outstripped any sense of morality, logic, or decency. It was like a flood, and once it started, nothing could stop it. Picture yourself now, in the heart of 17th century Europe, a world on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. The air is buzzing with optimism, new discoveries, and opportunities. But behind that shiny exterior is a dark undercurrent. The colonial empires are expanding at breakneck speed. Spain, Portugal, France, and Britain are all scrambling to claim new territories, and with those new territories comes one critical resource: people. Human labor, to be specific. The Americas, with their lush land and endless opportunities for exploitation, were calling out to these nations, but they needed one thing above all: slaves. And it wasn't just about a moral failure, it was about a systematic drive to profit at any cost. The brutality was simply a byproduct of this greed-fueled race to dominate. Historians still argue whether the greed of European nations was driven purely by profit, or whether it was also about national prestige. The truth is, it was likely a bit of both. The slave trade was a critical part of the empire-building process. If one nation had a monopoly on sugar, tobacco, or cotton, it didn't just mean wealth, it meant power. To be the richest nation was to be the most powerful nation. And power meant control over land, people, resources, and ultimately, the global stage. Nations needed slaves to fuel their economies, but they also needed to beat each other to the punch. This was the ultimate race, with billions of dollars and millions of lives at stake. Let's take a closer look at Britain, for example. By the 18th century, Britain had firmly established itself as the undisputed leader of the transatlantic slave trade. They had established a fleet of ships that would sail to Africa, trade goods like textiles, firearms, and alcohol, and return with their human cargo. Those enslaved Africans would then be forced to work on the plantations of the Caribbean and the Americas, where the sugar, tobacco, and cotton they produced were shipped back to Europe, completing the cycle. But here's the thing. It wasn't just the ships and the plantations that made money. It was everything. The whole economy, from the merchant class to the shipbuilders, the textile manufacturers, and even the bankers, was reliant on this system. So how did Britain manage this? It was simple. They turned the human cost into an invisible one. The entire process was sanitized, turned into a numbers game where human lives were reduced to commodities. It wasn't just a moral failure. It was an economic necessity for these European nations. The greed wasn't limited to a few bad apples. It was a system-wide failure, a society-wide obsession with growth and wealth at all costs. And that greed spread like wildfire. But Britain wasn't alone in this. The French, Dutch, and Portuguese were equally entrenched in the business. If one nation stopped trading slaves, the others would just step in to fill the gap. The international nature of the trade meant that it wasn't just a few isolated nations that were exploiting African lives, it was a global system. And that system created a cycle that was nearly impossible to break. As long as there was money to be made, as long as there was land to cultivate, there was a demand for enslaved labor. Now, let's pause for a second and think about the impact of all this unchecked greed. This wasn't just about making a quick buck. This was about the birth of modern capitalism. The system of colonialism, fueled by the profits of the slave trade, laid the groundwork for the modern global economy. And the wealth generated from this exploitation didn't just enrich European nations, it also led to the development of powerful global industries that still exist today. The cotton and textile industries that grew in Britain and the Americas? They were directly tied to the labor of enslaved Africans. The rise of banking and finance? In large part, it was driven by the profits from the slave trade. Historians continue to debate the extent to which this economic system is still influencing the world today. Was the modern capitalist system, in some ways, built on the blood of enslaved people? The more you look at it, the more it seems like the entire economic structure was founded on this exploitation. The seeds of modern wealth, prosperity, and power were planted in the soil of human suffering, and those seeds grew into the massive institutions we now take for granted. So, as you stand back and look at the broader landscape of history, you realize that the unchecked greed of European nations wasn't just a byproduct of the slave trade, it was its engine. It drove the entire system, and the consequences of that greed are still being felt today. The wealth amassed by European empires through the exploitation of African labor is still woven into the fabric of the modern world. It's in the infrastructure, the financial systems, and the industries that dominate global trade. The pursuit of wealth and power didn't just shape the past, it shaped the world we live in today. Let's be honest for a second. While we've spent a lot of time talking about Britain's role in the transatlantic slave trade, the British weren't the only ones in the race for wealth, power, and, well, human lives. No, this was a global enterprise, and European powers from Spain to France, Portugal, and the Netherlands all had their fingers in the pie. It wasn't just a few nations working together in a cooperative effort, it was a full-blown competition, one where each player was trying to outdo the other in the quest for resources, territory, and most disturbingly, slaves. Imagine this: you're sitting in a room surrounded by maps, charts, and ship's logs. There's a heated discussion going on, with representatives from Spain, France, the Netherlands, and Portugal all vying for dominance in the Americas and Africa. But here's the catch: while they're all pretending to cooperate for the greater good of their empires, what they're really fighting over is control of the slave trade. If you controlled the trade routes, you controlled the wealth. And controlling wealth meant controlling power. These countries weren't just in it for the sugar and cotton. They were in it for the manpower that would make their colonial ventures thrive. The Spanish were some of the first to get in on the action, establishing colonies in the Caribbean and the Americas as early as the 1500s. The Spanish crown had a monopoly on the transatlantic slave trade for a while, with their ships bringing enslaved Africans to work on sugar and tobacco plantations, as well as to mine gold and silver. But the problem for the Spanish was that they didn't have the resources to meet the growing demand for slaves. That's where the Portuguese came in. Portugal had already established a network of forts and trading posts along the West African coast, so they were in prime position to dominate the trade in the early days. The Portuguese also became deeply involved in the transportation of enslaved Africans to the Americas, particularly to Brazil, where sugar and tobacco plantations flourished. The Portuguese were also at the forefront of pioneering the triangular trade, a system of trading between Europe, Africa, and the Americas that was both lucrative and horrifying in its scope. European goods like textiles, firearms, and rum would be exchanged for enslaved Africans, who were then transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. The enslaved people would work the plantations and mines, producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton that would be sent back to Europe, where they would be sold to fund more ships, more slaves, and more exploitation. It was an endless cycle of profit, and every nation involved was riding high on the backs of the enslaved. But here's the twist: the French, too, were deeply embedded in this system. By the 17th century, France had established its own colonies in the Caribbean, particularly in places like Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, where sugar was king. The French quickly became one of the largest consumers of enslaved labor, importing millions of Africans to work on their plantations. And like the British, they built their fortunes on this brutal system. The French were also big players in the triangular trade, bringing enslaved Africans to the Americas and returning with precious commodities that would fuel the European economies. And don't forget the Dutch. By the 1600s, the Dutch had become an empire in their own right, with their own shipping fleets and trading companies. The Dutch West India Company played a significant role in the transatlantic slave trade, establishing a network of forts and trading posts along the West African coast. They focused largely on transporting enslaved Africans to the Caribbean and South America, where they worked sugar plantations. The Dutch, like the others, were motivated by profit. Enslaved labor was cheap, and the crops they produced were extremely valuable. Dutch traders also played a key role in transporting enslaved people to North America, especially in the early days of the colony of New Amsterdam, which would later become New York City. Historians still argue whether these nations had a moral understanding of the trade they were engaged in or whether they were simply too blinded by wealth to care. Was it sheer greed that motivated them, or did they genuinely believe that slavery was a necessary part of the economic system? Many scholars argue that the colonial powers saw enslaved people as a means to an end, human labor to fuel their burgeoning empires. The idea of human beings as property, as tools to generate wealth, became so ingrained in these societies that the moral implications of the trade were hardly questioned. The desire for more land, more crops, more slaves, everything else was secondary. The shocking thing here is how coordinated these countries were in their exploitation. Sure, they were rivals, but they also had common interests. The more slaves they could move across the Atlantic, the richer they became. If one country wanted to cut ties with the slave trade, the others would simply fill the gap. In fact, by the late 18th century, the British, French, and Dutch were all fully entrenched in a kind of international competition to dominate the transatlantic slave trade. The competition didn't end with the arrival of abolition, it continued for years after, as countries tried to maintain their economic foothold in the post-slavery world. So, let's zoom back out. As you stand at the intersection of these great empires, watching the flow of ships filled with human lives, you realize that the transatlantic slave trade wasn't just a matter of individual nations getting rich off the backs of enslaved Africans. No, it was a global system, one built on greed, cooperation, and competition. Each empire played its part, each one seeking to dominate, to control, and to profit from the exploitation of millions of people. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is not one of isolated nations or disconnected events. It's the story of a world system, a global network that relied on the exploitation of human lives. And the nations involved weren't just passive participants. They were active players in this tragic, violent game of empire building. And that global competition for wealth and power? It's one of the darkest chapters in human history, and its effects are still felt today. Now let's dive into one of the most insidious aspects of the transatlantic slave trade, the role of religion. It's easy to imagine that religion, in its purest form, is about love, peace, and compassion. So, how did it become such a powerful tool in justifying one of history's most horrific systems of exploitation? How did those who claimed to follow the teachings of Christ use religion as a moral excuse for the unimaginable cruelty of slavery? The answer lies in the way religion was manipulated to serve the interests of the powerful. Imagine this: you're in 17th century Europe, where Christianity is not just a personal belief, it's woven into the fabric of society. Churches dominate the landscape, and religious leaders hold immense power. Yet, amid all this religious fervor, the transatlantic slave trade is in full swing. The message you hear from pulpits and theologians is that slavery isn't just inevitable, it's righteous. You're told that Africans, by virtue of their supposed heathen ways, are destined to serve the civilized Europeans, whose mission it is to spread Christianity to these lost souls. The enslaved aren't just working for their masters, they're fulfilling a divine purpose. Now let's unpack this. At the time, many European colonists believed that their right to enslave Africans was sanctioned by God. They saw themselves as benevolent missionaries, spreading Christianity to the heathens in Africa and the Americas. This justification was rooted in a distorted reading of Christian doctrine, particularly the so-called curse of Ham, which was taken from the Bible and twisted to justify the enslavement of African people. According to this misguided interpretation, the descendants of Ham, one of Noah's sons, were cursed to be servants of others. This became the theological proof that African people were meant to be subjugated and enslaved. Historians still argue whether this interpretation of the Bible was intentionally used to justify slavery, or if it was a convenient excuse created to serve economic interests. Some scholars argue that Christian missionaries genuinely believed that enslaving Africans was a way to save their souls, while others suggest that the slave trade simply co-opted Christian teachings for economic gain. Either way, the fact remains that religion was used as a tool to turn what should have been a moral outrage into something acceptable, almost righteous. Let's take a moment to consider the hypocrisy of it all. On one hand, you have Europeans, particularly those in positions of power, proclaiming that they are on a divine mission to spread Christian values. Yet, on the other hand, they are engaging in a trade that treats other human beings as property, stripping them of their dignity and humanity. How could people who prided themselves on their Christian virtues reconcile this? The answer is that they didn't have to. They simply twisted Christian teachings to fit their own needs. This isn't just about a few individuals using religion to justify their actions. It's about how religion became an entire system of moral justification. Churches, theologians, and religious leaders were often complicit in this process, either by directly supporting the trade or by remaining silent as millions of people were subjected to unimaginable suffering. Christianity, in this context, was not just a private belief, it was an institutionalized tool of empire building. But what about the enslaved people themselves? How did they view religion? For many, Christianity was a way to survive in the face of unimaginable hardship. Enslaved Africans were often forcibly converted to Christianity by their masters. But instead of simply accepting the religion as it was presented to them, many enslaved people infused their faith with their own traditions and beliefs, creating a rich, hybrid religious culture that helped them maintain their sense of identity and humanity. Christianity, in this context, wasn't just a tool of oppression, it became a source of strength and resistance. Enslaved Africans saw the Bible not as a justification for their suffering, but as a promise of freedom and justice. Historians still argue about the role of Christianity in the resistance against slavery. Some suggest that the Christian doctrine of liberation was used to fuel revolts and rebellions, while others emphasize the role of African traditional beliefs in resisting the dehumanization of slavery. But one thing is clear: religion was not just a passive tool of the oppressors. It was also a weapon of resistance for those who sought to reclaim their humanity. Religion's role in the transatlantic slave trade was not just a matter of individual belief, it was a systemic force that helped maintain the status quo. The idea that slavery was divinely sanctioned made it easier for the powerful to ignore the moral implications of their actions, while it gave the enslaved hope and a means of resistance. The twisted use of religion to justify slavery is a testament to the lengths people will go to when their own greed and desire for power are at stake. And even though the institutions that upheld the transatlantic slave trade have long since crumbled, the legacy of these justifications continues to shape our world today. The idea that religion can be manipulated to support systems of exploitation is one of the most enduring aspects of this history. As you reflect on this, it's hard not to feel the weight of the moral contradictions. How did a religion based on love and forgiveness become so deeply entwined with one of the most brutal systems of human exploitation? The answer is as complex as it is tragic. But what's clear is that religion, used as a tool of justification, helped sustain the transatlantic slave trade for centuries. And that, in itself, is one of the most chilling aspects of this history. By now, you've seen how the transatlantic slave trade was built, on greed, bad maps, rum, and a twisted use of religion. But here's the thing, the story wasn't entirely one of submission. Enslaved Africans resisted, in ways big and small, every single day. Resistance wasn't just an occasional flare-up. It was woven into the very fabric of their lives. And it wasn't always obvious to the oppressors. Some of it was quiet and subtle, some of it was daring and violent, but all of it sent the same message. They were human, not property. Picture yourself now on a plantation somewhere in the Caribbean. The sun blazes overhead, the sugar cane stretches for miles, and the overseer is shouting orders. You, as one of the enslaved, know that your every movement is being watched, yet you find ways to resist. Maybe it's working slower than you're supposed to, pretending not to understand instructions, or secretly sabotaging equipment. These acts seem small to the outside world, almost invisible, but they were acts of defiance, tiny rebellions that chipped away at the system. Every slow step, every broken tool, every whispered word of solidarity was a way of saying, "I will survive, even if you try to break me." Historians still argue whether these subtle acts of resistance were widespread or isolated to particular plantations. The truth is probably a bit of both. But what's clear is that enslaved people were far from passive victims. They found ways to assert agency in an oppressive system designed to strip them of all control. And these small acts mattered. They kept hope alive and reminded everyone involved that enslaved people were more than the property the traders and plantation owners claimed them to be. Of course, not all resistance was quiet. Some of it was violent, dramatic, and audacious. Revolts happened on plantations, aboard ships, and in port towns. The most famous example is the Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791. Enslaved people in Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, rose up against the French colonists, eventually creating the first free black republic in the Americas. These revolts were terrifying for the Europeans. They challenged the very foundations of the slave economy and demonstrated the potential for enslaved people to reclaim their freedom through force. And yet, smaller-scale uprisings happened regularly, though they rarely make it into the history books. Resistance wasn't limited to physical rebellion either. Cultural preservation was another form of defiance. Enslaved Africans maintained their languages, music, and spiritual practices, even when they were forbidden. The stories, songs, and rituals became secret codes and forms of solace. In these acts, they carved out a sense of identity that the slave system tried to erase. You can imagine the quiet courage it took to maintain a piece of your culture while surrounded by constant threats of punishment. It was a form of resistance as vital as revolts, because it kept the memory of home alive and nurtured community in impossible circumstances. Historians still debate how much African cultural practices influenced resistance across the Americas. Some argue that spiritual traditions and communal structures gave enslaved people the tools to organize uprisings and maintain solidarity. Others emphasize the importance of individual acts of rebellion that inspired others. Either way, culture, identity, and faith became intertwined with resistance, providing strength in a system designed to erase both. There were also brave acts at sea. Shipboard revolts, although rare due to the tight confinement of the Middle Passage, occurred when enslaved Africans seized weapons, attacked crews, and attempted to retake their freedom. Even when these uprisings failed, they were testaments to the human spirit and the refusal to be subdued. The idea that captives could, even momentarily, overturn the oppressive system, terrified traders and prompted harsher regulations and punishments. Resistance created fear, and that fear revealed the fragility of the system. It was only successful because the enslaved were kept powerless through violence, isolation, and deception. And here's the paradox. The very oppression meant to crush the human spirit also became a catalyst for ingenuity, courage, and resilience. Each act of resistance, small, hidden, or overt, was a statement of humanity. They resisted the erasure of their lives, their stories, and their families. Even in chains, they found ways to assert their existence. The system of slavery, as brutal as it was, couldn't fully erase the resilience of the human spirit. In fact, that resilience would eventually fuel the abolition movements that shook the world. So, as you picture these acts of defiance, from the smallest gestures to the largest revolts, remember this: resistance was constant. It wasn't just an occasional event, or a footnote in history. It was a daily fight for dignity, identity, and survival. The enslaved never fully accepted their oppression, they pushed against it, challenged it, and in doing so, preserved a spark of freedom that no chain, whip, or law could ever extinguish. And that spark, that insistence on humanity, became the foundation for generations to come. Alright, we've reached a critical point in our story, the end of the transatlantic slave trade. If you've been following along, you've seen how the system grew, fed by greed, violence, and an almost incomprehensible disregard for human life. But now, we're at a moment of massive upheaval. A time when the world, though deeply entrenched in the horrors of slavery, was beginning to stir with the first murmurs of change. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but something was shifting. The global tide was turning, and the end of the slave trade was no longer a distant dream. It was a real, palpable possibility. So, what sparked this shift? How did something so entrenched, so deeply woven into the fabric of society, begin to unravel? The answer, like so much of history, lies in a combination of pressure, persistence, and changing circumstances. One key factor was the growing moral outrage. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, abolitionist movements were gaining momentum. In Europe and the Americas, a growing number of people, many of them former slaves themselves, began to speak out against the slave trade, calling it what it truly was, an abomination. The voices of those demanding an end to the trade grew louder and more organized. But while public outcry was essential, it wasn't the only thing driving the change. Let's backtrack for a second. Imagine you're in Britain in the late 1700s. The British Empire is at the height of its power, its wealth built in no small part on the slave trade. The sugar and cotton industries, which had made Britain one of the richest nations in the world, were entirely dependent on enslaved labor. But something is happening. Abolitionists, including figures like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, are pushing against the tide. They're challenging the very foundation of the empire's prosperity, arguing that no amount of wealth is worth the suffering of millions. The abolitionist cause was initially seen as radical, even extreme, but over time it gathered force. People began to realize that it wasn't just about economic benefit, it was about human rights. A moral battle was being fought, and slowly, more and more people came to believe that the slave trade was an affront to basic human dignity. And this wasn't just a battle happening in Britain. The idea of freedom and equality was spreading like wildfire across the globe. The American Revolution had already planted the seeds of liberty, and the French Revolution was showing what a world without oppression could look like. The Haitian Revolution was the ultimate example of the enslaved fighting back and taking control of their destiny. These revolutions weren't just political, they were ideological shifts that questioned the foundations of slavery. They were proof that enslaved people could, and would, resist their oppressors. These revolutions sent a message to the entire world: no system, no matter how powerful, is invincible. Historians still argue whether the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade was driven by moral outrage, economic decline, or political change. Some say it was the economic impact of slavery that caused its eventual demise, particularly with the rise of industrialization. The global demand for sugar and cotton was slowing down, and new forms of labor were beginning to take their place. The rise of new agricultural systems and industries, along with the increased reliance on wage labor, made the slave trade less economically viable. But here's the thing, no matter the cause, the result was the same: slavery, in its transatlantic form, was on the verge of being stamped out. But even as the trade began to fall apart, it didn't end without a fight. Abolitionists had to push, year after year, for legislative change. They had to argue, educate, and rally to make their case, despite resistance from those whose fortunes depended on the trade. The British Parliament, for example, didn't abolish the slave trade until 1807, and even then, it wasn't an immediate end. The American South, where slavery was deeply entrenched, didn't abolish slavery until 1865, and even after the abolition of the trade, slavery itself persisted in various forms across the globe. By the early 19th century, the British government finally passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, and in 1833, slavery itself was abolished throughout the British Empire. In the United States, the end of the transatlantic slave trade came in 1808, but it took a bloody civil war and the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 to finally free enslaved people in the South. The end of the trade was far from perfect, and the ripple effects would continue for years to come. Even after the legal abolition of slavery, the racial inequalities and legacies of exploitation remained entrenched in societies around the world. And let's not forget the Africans themselves. Their role in ending the transatlantic slave trade cannot be overstated. While abolitionists in Europe and the Americas were advocating for change, the enslaved people themselves were fighting a different fight, one for survival, one for dignity, and one for freedom. It was their resistance, both violent and nonviolent, that created the pressure needed to dismantle the system. It wasn't just the moral arguments in Europe that ended the trade, it was the active, persistent refusal of the enslaved to accept their fate. It was the Haitian Revolution, the resistance on ships, the everyday defiance in the fields. This was a fight that couldn't be won just through petitions and speeches, it was won by those who refused to be broken. So, as you stand at the threshold of this chapter, the world is beginning to change. The transatlantic slave trade, though it didn't end easily, has finally come to an end, or at least to a turning point. The victory of abolition is hard won, but it's not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a long journey toward justice and equality, one that is still ongoing. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade may have been a victory, but the legacy of that trade continues to shape our world, our economies, and our societies in ways we are only just beginning to understand. Alright, we've reached a critical point in our story, the end of the transatlantic slave trade. If you've been following along, you've seen how the system grew, fed by greed, violence, and an almost incomprehensible disregard for human life. But now, we're at a moment of massive upheaval. A time when the world, though deeply entrenched in the horrors of slavery, was beginning to stir with the first murmurs of change. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but something was shifting. The global tide was turning, and the end of the slave trade was no longer a distant dream, it was a real, palpable possibility. So, what sparked this shift? How did something so entrenched, so deeply woven into the fabric of society, begin to unravel? The answer, like so much of history, lies in a combination of pressure, persistence, and changing circumstances. One key factor was the growing moral outrage. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, abolitionist movements were gaining momentum. In Europe and the Americas, a growing number of people, many of them former slaves themselves, began to speak out against the slave trade, calling it what it truly was, an abomination. The voices of those demanding an end to the trade grew louder and more organized. But while public outcry was essential, it wasn't the only thing driving the change. Let's backtrack for a second. Imagine you're in Britain in the late 1700s. The British Empire is at the height of its power, its wealth built in no small part on the slave trade. The sugar and cotton industries, which had made Britain one of the richest nations in the world, were entirely dependent on enslaved labor. But something is happening. Abolitionists, including figures like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, are pushing against the tide. They're challenging the very foundation of the empire's prosperity, arguing that no amount of wealth is worth the suffering of millions. The abolitionist cause was initially seen as radical, even extreme, but over time it gathered force. People began to realize that it wasn't just about economic benefit, it was about human rights. A moral battle was being fought, and slowly, more and more people came to believe that the slave trade was an affront to basic human dignity. And this wasn't just a battle happening in Britain. The idea of freedom and equality was spreading like wildfire across the globe. The American Revolution had already planted the seeds of liberty, and the French Revolution was showing what a world without oppression could look like. The Haitian Revolution was the ultimate example of the enslaved fighting back and taking control of their destiny. These revolutions weren't just political, they were ideological shifts that questioned the foundations of slavery. They were proof that enslaved people could, and would, resist their oppressors. These revolutions sent a message to the entire world: no system, no matter how powerful, is invincible. Historians still argue whether the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade was driven by moral outrage, economic decline, or political change. Some say it was the economic impact of slavery that caused its eventual demise, particularly with the rise of industrialization. The global demand for sugar and cotton was slowing down, and new forms of labor were beginning to take their place. The rise of new agricultural systems and industries, along with the increased reliance on wage labor, made the slave trade less economically viable. But here's the thing: no matter the cause, the result was the same: slavery, in its transatlantic form, was on the verge of being stamped out. But even as the trade began to fall apart, it didn't end without a fight. Abolitionists had to push, year after year, for legislative change. They had to argue, educate, and rally to make their case, despite resistance from those whose fortunes depended on the trade. The British Parliament, for example, didn't abolish the slave trade until 1807, and even then, it wasn't an immediate end. The American South, where slavery was deeply entrenched, didn't abolish slavery until 1865, and even after the abolition of the trade, slavery itself persisted in various forms across the globe. By the early 19th century, the British government finally passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, and in 1833, slavery itself was abolished throughout the British Empire. In the United States, the end of the transatlantic slave trade came in 1808, but it took a bloody civil war and the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 to finally free enslaved people in the South. The end of the trade was far from perfect, and the ripple effects would continue for years to come. Even after the legal abolition of slavery, the racial inequalities and legacies of exploitation remained entrenched in societies around the world. And let's not forget the Africans themselves. Their role in ending the transatlantic slave trade cannot be overstated. While abolitionists in Europe and the Americas were advocating for change, the enslaved people themselves were fighting a different fight, one for survival, one for dignity, and one for freedom. It was their resistance, both violent and nonviolent, that created the pressure needed to dismantle the system. It wasn't just the moral arguments in Europe that ended the trade, it was the active, persistent refusal of the enslaved to accept their fate. It was the Haitian Revolution, the resistance on ships, the everyday defiance in the fields. This was a fight that couldn't be won just through petitions and speeches, it was won by those who refused to be broken. So, as you stand at the threshold of this chapter, the world is beginning to change. The transatlantic slave trade, though it didn't end easily, has finally come to an end, or at least to a turning point. The victory of abolition is hard-won, but it's not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a long journey toward justice and equality, one that is still ongoing. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade may have been a victory, but the legacy of that trade continues to shape our world, our economies, and our societies in ways we are only just beginning to understand.